Welcome everyone for joining, and especially those overseas joining us on the webinar broadcast. So for a sense of introduction, Shannan is my name. I'm one of the co-founders here at Rosterfy. What we exist to be is the very best in the world at managing large-scale workforce and work extensively with emergency service organisations around the world, including numerous St John organisations. And I'm joined by someone with a lot of experience in that space, Alan Eade. Alan, it's a pleasure to have you joining us. So good afternoon, and thank you, Alan. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Shannon. It's wonderful to be invited to speak with you today. I'm really excited to chat about, see where this goes. We could end up down any kind of rabbit hole. So.
We could. We had a great briefing session, didn't we, talking about all things emergency service, paramedic, St John, volunteering. So now, look, Alan, I'll let you introduce yourself a little, because I don't want to discredit some of your work in terms of the history that you have. But I guess the most notably probably is your work with St John Ambulance Australia, being both the Chief Paramedic and the Chief Commissioner. But you've had a storied career across emergency service and first responder. Alan, do you want to just give us a sample of your work? What got you motivated to begin with in the start, and some of the highlights along the way, including your work at Monash most recently?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I've been really fortunate to have a really varied and variety, lots of variety in my career. So what got me into emergency services and community services? Probably my family. If I go back to my roots, I started. My parents were very active in the scouting movement, and my father in the estate emergency service as well. That got me some interest, and so it just started my altruistic sort of personality and my desire to give back to community from a really early age. But I rebelled as a teenager and didn't want to follow the family footsteps, and so got into St John as a cadet, and started my very first event there was the Ash Wednesday bushfires. So nothing too big,
wow.
Nothing too significant.
How old were you? And because that's one of Australia's largest, I guess, disasters, isn't it? Like, what was that experience like, Alan?
Yeah, I just turned 14, and so that experience probably shaped my journey. And when I proceeded through the St John organisation, ultimately to become the Chief Commissioner, and when I had the ability to make decisions, I stopped 14-year-olds going to bushfires. Probably not the wisest thing to do. So it sort of coloured my development, but I've always been fortunate to push the boundaries. Professionally, I'm a registered nurse and now a critical care paramedic. I work with the State Ambulance Service and continue my volunteering with St John, and I'm very proud about that. But I've also got a passion for development of the paramedicine profession, and so I've worked in government. I've been the Chief Paramedic for the State Government of Victoria, the first appointment of such a person in Australasia, and I'm been fortunate enough to be appointed as an adjunct associate professor at Monash University for my paramedics and my paramedic practice activities. So
interesting.
Very done a lot.
The last part there, it's probably a little different to. It's a natural flow, I suppose, from your experience that you can do that. Can you talk to us a bit about what your work at Monash looks like?
So I spend most of my time in course development, and so the most recent program of work was around the establishment of the new Masters of Paramedic Practitioner, so the advanced practice end of paramedicine, and dealing with the establishment of that program. And there's a lot of legislative and regulatory work to go through to make that fit for purpose. So following on from decades of work to get paramedics registered as registered health practitioners through the Australian College of Paramedicine, and then my work is in the state government. I now work with Monash to help them really take these novel and advance these new visions for where paramedicine can be. I teach into the undergraduate programs around toxicology, drugs and substance use of my area of specialty, and extensively support the development of our critical care practitioners. But in terms of advancing the latest and pushing the boundaries of where paramedicine will be into the future, then the paramedic practitioner space has been my area of development in the last couple of years.
Yeah, fantastic, Alan. Thank you. And I think your point you raised before about being 14 years old on the front lines and working in the bushfires is probably a great way to start today, because today there's going to be a real theme of volunteerism and emergency services. And so perhaps your best summary of sort of how the relationship of volunteerism has changed since when you were a 14-year-old to perhaps how you see it now, and maybe that interaction between volunteers and these organisations on the front line. How have you seen that evolve?
It's an ever-changing feast. So when I started very, very early on, there was no shortage of volunteers. People actually had waiting lists in many cases to join the volunteer emergency services, or they were just enormous in their size. And there were 80,000 plus members in the CFA in 1983, and it just grew post Ash Wednesday.
Alan, quickly, what do you think that might be now then as a reference point? Would you have any idea if it was 80,000 back then?
Yeah, the latest annual report reports less than 50. Less than 50,000. It's a nearly 50% contraction. In terms of the and people joined voluntary organisations and were basically there for life in the emergency services. You joined the SES, or you joined the CFA, or you joined St John, and you just stayed there. And whereas if we look at our volunteering in its current form, all organisations, doesn't matter who they are, emergency services or otherwise, are struggling to attract people. And then when they do attract them, then volunteering has become very transient. And I'm sure that's in part the way our lives work, and the fact that people used to be, if we look at it back in those early years in the 80s, people were employed in one or two employers across their entire life cycle, whereas now people, when they're employed, work in multiple different employers, and they're averaging 10 or more employers across their life cycle. Their volunteering is reflective of their work, and that's appropriate, because volunteering is just another form of work. And we're going to get into that when we start talking about standards and things. But if we factor in the fact that their volunteering should reflect the way that their work goes, then we need to change the way we think about people volunteering, and that we don't have people volunteering for life anymore, and that what we can do to maximise their contribution for the time that we have them is the focus of the organisations that they're volunteering into.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there's certainly a lot to get into around that. But perhaps what are some of the challenges perhaps you see in this day and age? Because I guess it's unavoidable, right? The increase of risk and all these things that you need to be really appropriately diligent with, right, for onboarding new volunteers and things. But what are some of the challenges you see perhaps nowadays that weren't the case back in the 80s, perhaps, of recruiting and then retaining volunteers, Alan?
Oh, well, nobody in their right mind would send a 14-year-old to a fireground in 2025, but we did in 1983. So there's an expectation from the community, particularly in my area of primary volunteering, which is in healthcare. So people see healthcare as being provided by professionals, and the expectation is that the healthcare that they're going to receive is going to not, even from first aiders, will closer resemble the care that they would expect to receive from paramedics than traditionally what we know a first aider to be. And so that expectation is felt by not only the organisations but the people working in those spaces, and so they set their minimum standard at a much higher level than what it was in the 80s. Our expectation of our volunteers is that they come with capacity that if we were looking at it from a 1980s lens, would be something that we would only expect out of doctors. They expect our volunteers, first aiders these days, to be able to recognise all kinds of different medical conditions, do CPR, provide defibrillation, use oxygen units, and give drugs for pain management. None of these things exist. These things didn't exist in the 80s, and but that's now become an expectation of just a first aider.
Sure. Alan, have the roles and responsibilities changed then? I guess, as you said, we're not sending 14-year-olds to the front line anymore, but is it just the expectations gone up, or have the positions and the roles drastically changed?
I don't think the roles have changed. The responsibility associated with the roles has probably changed. I think if we factor in that, I use Ash Wednesdays because it's where I started, but it's also a really telltale. It's a landmark point in volunteer legislation or legislation in general, work and health and safety legislation. The Ash Wednesday bushfire was a catalyst for enormous change around making things safer for all emergency service responders, and volunteers were wrapped up in that as employees, as they should always be. There isn't a variation. You work for an organisation whether you're paid or otherwise. And that really came from that 1983 period, and it has evolved ever since. So I don't think there's been a change in some of the expectations have changed, but mostly around responsibility. We have to look after our people far better than we may have in the previous. We have an obligation to treat them under all of the normal regulatory frameworks, and that includes our work health and safety legislation. And the environment that we're deploying them into often is by its nature in the emergency services sector, it carries a level of risk that the organisations have to manage or mitigate to the best of their ability. But knowingly sending them into an area that has some uncontrolled hazards. And so that brings with it an expectation that we've prepared people well. That means that we have to do better induction, that we have to add additional education or training. It's not just about buying a new widget and it will keep everybody safe. Everybody's going to use the widget appropriately.
Yes, understood. Makes sense. I reflect, we were in Houston when one of the largest hurricanes went through. It was around the time of the Super Bowl, I think I recall, and they put a big call out to everyone to say, everyone come downtown to help out. And it just flooded the town centre with people, and it created almost an emergency in itself of people that were everywhere flooding around, and they had to send everyone home and start again the next day and almost be like, just do your little bits that you can. This was probably not, however many years ago this was, but I recall that being like the chaos that these emergencies can cause when the people then want to help so much as well. Can you reflect on that, Alan, where you see the mass lot of people wanting to help, but then trying to organize them as well? And perhaps reflecting on your role, as chief paramedic and others, like any advice for people to deal with that influx of people wanting to help them to best serve those people wanting to help, but also those that need the help in an organized manner?
I think certainly we've learned a lot over the last few decades of emergency. So unfortunately, Australia is no stranger to having them. And so we have had an opportunity, whether we've truly learnt, we seem to have to relearn things often. But I think, remind me to talk about Mud Army, because I think it's emblematic of your point of overwhelming numbers.
Yes.
But I think that the biggest thing that we have learnt is that it's not all about donating goods. So if we look back at Cyclone Tracy in the 70s, the call went out, it's Christmas, it's awful. We need to send all of our Christmas presents to Darwin because they don't have any Christmas presents because their houses have all been blown away. And so we had plane after plane flying in stuff that was just then rotted on the side of the tarmac. So everybody in Australia felt good, but actually the people in Darwin were still needed somewhere to live and needed food. And that's just one example. Beyond that, what we've seen is people have started now to move down to actually what we need to do is help people build in place. And so donating money and the Red Cross campaigns are far more beneficial in most cases than come and dump all of your unwanted clothing, which is what it sort of it sometimes can become if we're not really quite clear about what the needs of the community are. And then helping them build means that they get local people to build, which means that we're supporting the local economy. We have, I think, learnt that to a degree, but still, all of these large-scale events, the desire to send something when actually the need is to support the people who are there to rebuild themselves is key. In terms of overwhelming numbers, I think the one in most recent memory is it was 2011 floods that went through southeast Queensland after tropical cyclone associated with Cyclone Tracy, and then the downstream effects of the Brisbane floods. There was an enormous response from the community that overwhelmed the emergency response in many ways. And the challenge there was that there were so many people, and they started to organise themselves in the absence of it being done officially. And the Mud Army, as they embraced that term wholeheartedly, did absolutely phenomenal work, but it was frequently uncoordinated. And there was a lot of people who actually got injured and actually quite unwell because they were playing in some pretty toxic residue. But the ability to control that level of spontaneous volunteering just wasn't in the psyche. That has, I don't think any of us would be able to control that still very, very well, but spontaneous volunteering has been a focus for the emergency services sector for since those 2011 floods, to try and work out how best to coordinate people into small groups and task effort to small areas rather than try and do everything on a large scale. And that's where success and the learning has really been, I think. Take people who are motivated and keen, wherever you can keep them safe, and task them to a specific small space, rather than trying to manage a large volunteer group who aren't coordinated over a wider area. That means that you can give them put them under control of a local area emergency services representative, and achieve an outcome. Everyone feels good about their contribution. You actually get the outcome you're looking for, but you're not trying to build a coordination system for people who are, by definition, not going to be coordinated.
Yeah, interesting. Because again, you are much further into this space than I am, Alan. But people I've spoken to across the time, they often sort of reflect and say, the preparedness is a challenge because it's almost like they get through the flood or they get through the bushfire and then they go, all right, we're exhausted and we've done our thing. And also maybe budget's burnt it through because, we've used all that budget in a sense that it's hard to then plan ahead for the next one. And the next one it comes and it's almost like it's a surprise in a way. And there hasn't been a lot of thought ahead, especially when we're talking specifically around volunteers. Things I've heard is that there's, just massive spreadsheets that are around from different engagements, and they'll just blast everyone on the spreadsheet and hope that they are around and can come through. I don't know. Have you sort of seen that and maybe reflect on that proactiveness and preparedness with volunteering? Because it's hard to look at a sort of gold standard. Really, I haven't seen around the world, or maybe you have, of someone that has a really contained group of great volunteers that they can call on when these things pop up at a large scale, more than just the day-to-day operations, Alan.
That's the key point. There are some extraordinary examples that are really small that are for day-to-day operations.
Yes.
Some of the mountain rescue teams in the UK are just overwhelming. Like they're there, they'll get going in minutes. The NLRI, the rescue boats, they're amazing. But that's day to day. We're not talking. But if you were talking about large scale, no, I don't think there is one. You mentioned spreadsheets. I think many organisations are still in that, or they may even have databases. They might have evolved from spreadsheets. But you ask them the question, how many members do you have? And they go, we've got 3,500. It's how many active members do you have? Oh, we have 300 that do everything. They have enormous disconnects between numbers on record versus actually available staff, and I think that there is the risk in our system is that a lot of organisations are reflecting their capacity based on what's on the books or what's in their database. But the reality is, if we tried to access that for a large scale event, then we would get 10% at best.
Yeah, I understand.
That is a real risk in our emergency services sector. Yeah. The other one is around no one volunteer or no one emergency management organisation can do it all. They are all interconnected and absolutely dependent upon each other for success. Our health-based emergency organisations maintain the capacity for our rescue organisations to do their frontline work. We keep them healthy so that they can work for longer. So without health and sanitation and all that goes with that, then our rescue operations suffer, and they don't have the depth to maintain these campaign deployments as long as what we are used to.
Yeah, Alan. Again, for maybe from the outside looking in, and speaking to people that have worked in these over the years, it's a question: how do you maintain the momentum and the enthusiasm, Alan? Because I see it going, it's on the news right now, I'm going to go down and help or do something. But that's all well and good for the first little spike, but the work remains for months, years in some cases. Alan, have you seen that, and that maybe your experience across the years of how do you maintain that momentum and keep volunteers engaged to keep coming back? Or, Alan, do you just reflect and say, well, these people are here for the start, and we're going to get a new bunch of people for the middle and the end as well? Like, what's your thoughts on that, Alan?
It's the latter. We get a lot where there's an enormous amount of interest. We take the people who are less likely to, who are the unusual volunteers up the in the front end. Interesting. Because they're not going to hang around. On the cameras, it's almost like they follow the TV cameras. When the cameras go away, so do they. So we utilise that motivation while it's available. If we're talking about a volunteer workforce, we're talking about a workforce that has different motivation. We're not paying them to be there. In fact, it's costing them money to be there in most cases. So their motivation is whatever it is that brought them forward. A desire to do good, an altruism. They got to wear a uniform. It made them feel good. They got 5 seconds of camera. I don't know. Whatever it is, they've chosen to come and help. And so we utilise that while it's available to us, and try and support them with experienced staff that have got longitudinal engagement with the emergency services sector or the organisation that they're representing. That's the quality. That maintains a standard across the deployments. And then when the initial volunteers motivation has started to wane, and then we go back to the regular members of the organisation for that ongoing longitudinal, pre-planned in many ways deployment. So one of the hardest things to do when it's all in front of the television about this big thing that's happening is to take some of the people who are wanting to deploy and say, fantastic, it's 8 o'clock at night, I'll need you tomorrow at midday. And at midday tomorrow, because at midday tomorrow, all these people that have just been randomly turning up, I'm going to have to get them off the field of play. And because if I don't, then they're going to hurt themselves. I have to replace them with someone. So thank you for your offer. I'll need you tomorrow at midday, or something similar. And people can find that really difficult. But I want to go, well, there's going to be plenty for everybody, and I'm really going to need your help tomorrow at about midday.
Because Alan, that's an interesting one when you got this flurry of people, especially when it's regional, right? And in random locations that you cannot control. They're not all going to a central spot in Brisbane and saying we're all ready to queue up and in an orderly fashion and do it this way. So they turn up to these regional locations, right, with a couple of people there. How do you possibly maintain a standard of risk and health and safety, Alan, and induction and sign this before you get on site? How is that possible, Alan? And do you use systems for that?
It's only possible inside an already organised entity. So in terms of the spontaneous volunteer, I've come and I only want to help in Green Street. Because I have 2 friends in Green Street, so I'll help anyone in Green Street, but I don't want to help anywhere else. That sort of spontaneous volunteering really happens. Then they can't be tasked as part of the emergency response mechanism. They are there being good community support to their friends and their friends' neighbours, and so there isn't any induction in that particular circumstance. If they want to volunteer or participate with an existing organisation, then those organisations do need to provide that they are accepting them as staff effectively, so they have to be onboarded somehow. Those processes can be long and arduous, or they can be pragmatically short, but they need to be provided the necessary personal protective equipment to meet the environment they're going into, and have sufficient working knowledge and partnership with somebody else from that organisation to ensure that they can be safe in the workspace. And that's the obligation on the responder organisation to do.
Because Alan, one thing we spoke about the other day was we've been speaking to some large-scale emergency service organisations across Australia recently, and I won't mention the names, but some of these organisations, it takes a new volunteer 6 to 8 months sometimes to register and to onboard successfully. And rightly or wrongly, of course, there's lots of process that's required. How can we? What's the balance here, Alan, of speed and appropriate risk management, I suppose, Alan? How do you assess that?
Only 6 months is my response to that. There's plenty that even longer than that. So really small organisations find it really difficult to do compliance and induction and onboarding because they may have one person that's got to do it for every new hire or new volunteer that comes through the organisation, and so that can become onerous to achieve. And then really big organisations find that they lose humanity, and everybody's a number, and so everyone just does things the one way. There's no shortcuts. There's no consideration of the person. No, here's our onboarding pack. Everyone starts at the top. You work your way through the 97 different hurdles, and you graduate in 12 months. And there is no shorter process. So they're too big to have actually, factored the human. The simple reality is that neither of those is effective. Absolutely none of those. The way forward has to be that we need the opportunity to assess each person. If you have if you're joining an emergency services organisation, they may have a requirement for a minimum qualification for undertaking that role. So if you come into a health organisation, they all have a minimum health training package requirement, whether it's one of the first aid qualifications or whether it's as a health practitioner, depends on the job that you're coming to do, whether you're being paid or volunteering. And there is no shortcut for that. You have to hold that qualification. The regulations require it. But if you already have that qualification, why do we then make you do that qualification again? That makes no sense.
Spend another month.
Absolutely. So we lose time. You lose motivation because you're not feeling that your time is being valued appropriately. So if you have the necessary qualification and we can get through the necessary compliance checks, working with children is the one that slows us down the most in the health space, because all health people working in health need that. Then we get through, once we're through that and we have the qualification, we should be able to, in a crisis, deploy you with a partner from the organisation who can help you with the induction on the run material. So there are ways to shorten this time frame and still be compliant regulatory and legislatively.
Makes sense. And Alan, we've got a few questions from the audience. I'll go through a few now because we've probably got about 8 minutes left or so. One of those was around the use of technology, and obviously from 1983 to now, it's changed a lot, Alan. But I guess from where you see it now, if we, in particular, again, for volunteers, a couple of core facets being that recruitment and onboarding, and automating that as much as possible, right? As you referenced, the big orgs that it's very manual, or even for the small ones sometimes, very manual, touching and feeling every single part of that journey. That's very manually intensive sometimes. Then there's the risk side. If that's all in-person sessions and trainings and things, if people can't attend that session, it just pushes out another month till the next one. And then the last one there being around the deployments and the checking in, checking out, Alan, these things that I'm sure are required from a compliance standpoint to say that Shannan was on site at this location when this thing happened. How have you seen maybe the evolution of technology in that management of volunteers, Alan? And perhaps if you look to the future, what are the things that you think we can improve on?
Oh, we can improve greatly, because regardless of the promise that we've been made over these decades, the uptake and the utilisation remains rather poor. If I look across the sector, we've always been promised that technology is going to make life easier, and everybody's got databases and what have you now, but I guarantee you that they're still not able to effectively process people efficiently, and I genuinely am sad that people are taking greater than 6 months, but that is common in the spaces that I look in, and that the worst thing for me is that they still don't have good and efficient check-in, check-out processes to really understand that Shannan was at Green Street on the 3rd of January. And so there is enormous opportunity for us to improve those aspects into the future. We are well past manual processing. The world moves too quickly, and so do our volunteers, so do our people, particularly our volunteers. We have to utilise the phone in their pocket to the power there to know where they are, to know when they've been volunteering or when they've been working, and to support them to check in, check out, as you were saying. It's not impossible, but organisations investing in the technology is a constant barrier. It would actually help them immensely, but they're too. But the argument is, I'm too busy to do something that'll help me.
And Alan, I think that was my point earlier around you finish the disaster and go, and then it's the budget. There's no budget, and then they can't plan ahead for the next one. And yet, so to your point that there is absolute room for improvement, and I think certainly from what we see, it's still very manual in the industry, and it does feel a little bit like a surprise each time a natural disaster hits us and we need large-scale response, that it is still going back to big spreadsheets often. And clearly, this isn't for everyone, but you hear of these stories, Alan. So it's about uptake and investment. Alan, would you agree?
It's without question, it's about investment, but it's a prioritising where that investment is needed.
Yeah.
And if we actually invest in effective systems, I'm going to be really careful about dropping the effective in, because there's lots of people that are trying to sell systems. But an effective system, then it actually reduces workload and improves efficiency moving forward. There's lots of that promise that, but there aren't that many that have been tested and shown to actually do what is advertised.
Is there any, Alan, that you can think of, even if it's not volunteer management necessarily, but are there any sort of system changes you've seen across your time where you go, wow, we are way better off because of investing and thinking ahead with technology? Is there anything that comes to mind, Alan?
There are some, there's far better tracking opportunities now using GPS based around the fact that everybody's got mobile phones, and we've seen not only that become safer for remotely deployed crews, but we've seen better targeting of assets to requests for assistance. That's not universal, but where those have been implemented, definitely it's been an improvement. In terms of availability of staff and visibility of who's around, lots of little bespoke activities have emerged. I mean, we're on a Rosterfy podcast, so there's clearly been an enormous investment and better coordination of your human database. The promise is still unrealised in a lot of areas. So,
makes sense, sure. So perhaps your summary there is the opportunity is there to do it better. It's about prioritisation, investment, and something to do it really well and do it properly. Alan, I think is probably what I'm grasping from it, and the capacity for change management too, Alan. When it's very easy to say we get by and we got through the last one, okay, we'll keep rolling with this as well. And so, Alan, I'm conscious of time. We're probably running to the end now. So, no, thank you. It's been really insightful, and I'm very grateful for you taking the time to spend with us. Is there any other sort of last remarks from your side, Alan, that you wanted to raise?
The emergency services sector is completely dependent upon volunteer and volunteerism for its success, and there will be more emergencies every season. And regardless of how we try and mitigate these in advance, and the better we get at preparation, there's always going to be a need for volunteer and volunteerism to support either the emergency response or the community's recovery from it. I am immensely grateful to everybody who is prepared to step up and contribute to the Australian community each season when we see just hardship and heartache beset our communities. So thank you everybody who's on the podcast for your participation and what you just do for the Australian community.
Yeah, good on you, Alan. Yeah, thank you so much. I certainly agree. It's I mean, when you talk about the toughest of roles in volunteerism, I think these are some of them, Alan, absolutely. So, we share the same here at Rosterfy. So thank you for your time, Alan, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Thank you very much.